So they call me the Scandinavian seer. So I am Catherine. So what I do is I work a lot with the youth, and I work, well, I do fall religiously, spiritually. I really emotion heart centered. Uh, that is just kind of how our family is, and also my rights of awareness and spirituality cannot be separated from me. So I'm the Scandinavian seer, and today I want to go off of a couple videos ago. I talked about affirmations and that how it becomes very uncomfortable for people to hear a lot of heart centered compliments, and they're just kindness, but also there's a character um, affirmation that is done to it, and a lot of people are very uncomfortable because they're not used to the actual true genuine people that have no ulterior motives, but they just want to be nice. But they also notice something that is really great about them, so they want to point that out so they can accentuate it, and give yourself a pat on the shoulder for being that way. And then last video I did was I do an ego versus superego, and I want to go a little bit more in detail with ego and superego because I really a lot of it is you have to understand what ego is and superego, and there's a lot of research on it, and they all have their own little separate definitions. So I'm going to try to encompass them together because it can be quite overwhelming. So ego, if we're looking at it, ego is all about how we are in this world. So university Scientologists, they would always say ego is 3D. No, that's here on earth. That's where we are here. And super ego is going to be something that is outside in the universe, that's aware that it combinates the solar systems, God, spirit, higher esoteric knowledges. And so some of the things that we talk about is a lot of that is esoteric and spiritual, colliding with our 3D, which is here in the universal baby stage, basically. So ego is a way to look at it, is if you can see ego is more of like an internal drive. Well, super ego is the same way. There's an internal drive, and both of them have their own struggles. So when I talk about ego, is it's best to identify it as it's fed from an external. So ego is 3D. It's here on this plane. And so if you're looking at it as this plane, remember, I am Scandinavian, so I do believe that there are 9 planes, but it's also in the biblical. So no matter which text you look at, and I'll do other videos on some of those, there is a lot of documentation from Scientologists to the Bible, to the Torah, to the Quran, that is all speaking about 9 different levels. Okay, and so mine is 9 realms, but it's outside. So ego is here on this plane. Middle Earth is kind of where we would label it, not just Lord of the Rings, but Middle Earth, and that is where we are still in adolescence, and we are driven by the people around us and by what we want in here. So they're wants. And then your super ego is more of the spiritual part, and that's more of your internal soul. And so that's more of an inside need. Like those are like your survival, and needs, and touch and love is another one, emotion based. So super ego is more of your emotion. Hey, spirituality, you are one with the universe, we're 5D. And then the ego is more of, hey, we're wants. I want this, and I want that, and I want this. A lot of wants, but those egos are driven by other people's and what they have. And so when you go into this, you got to look at ego as more of it's unconscious. It's an unconscious drive that I want what everybody else wants. I want what this, and I want to be powerful. I want to be rich. I want to look this way. I want that boyfriend or that girlfriend. I want that kind of car. I want that clothes. I want to eat the best stuff. I want a house like this. So those are wants here on the 3D. So that's ego, right? And then you have super ego, which is more as a spirituality, is I just need to be nurtured. I need to eat to survive, to breathe. I need oxygen to breathe, and to go on to the next day, but to speak, right? I need somebody to hear me. So those are not so much as materialistic 3D, because 5D is really where you get a lot of that fed. And so a lot of people will go to religious doctrines to get the superego. So when I go back to talking, we're talking about Freud. Freud did a lot of research on the ego and the superego, the unconscious and the conscious. So superego is the conscious. I am very aware that the ego is driving this car to want more materialistic things that they cannot take with them in another plane. And then the superego is the conscious going, but you can take parts of your soul to enlighten it, to heighten its state. But you need to feed it with certain nutrients. So I need necessities, but knowledge is another one. But knowledge, that's where we go. So Freudian did a lot of that, where ego needed to be balanced by the superego. So the superego was always keeping the ego in check if it could, but your superego needed to be fed as well. It needs to be nurtured, and it needs to have that needs met, spiritual needs. So there's a lot of doctrines, a lot of education, a lot of meditation, a lot of mindfulness that is becoming up and rise, because our philosophy is another one. Our bodies need it. 5D to here, your superego needs it to keep the ego in check. So you're noticing a lot here in our nation, in our world, where the ego is outraising the superego. And if you go back and you start looking at some of the history, you can kind of see where religious doctrine or philosophical doctrine has been pulled out. So I try to increase our philosophical doctrines, because in our discussions, because those are arguments of enlightening ourselves to get a different perception. And so I think I've mentioned before in a couple other videos, I'm not a big fan of CBT, because CBT is a very hard thing in intervention. And the reasons why is CBT keeps you in your brain. And so ego is ran by your brain, and brainwashing is quite easy, especially if you're just doing brain, thoughts. So ego is brain. It's 3D. It's here on this plane. It's I want, all I think about, everything is my thoughts. Nothing is outside of that. So I'm not big on cognitive behavior, because that only focuses on the brain. It does not encompass everything else, because you're a person that is more than just your words and your thoughts, but your thoughts are also subjective on your experience, your wants, your egotistical wants, unconscious drives. You're feeding by your exterior peers of I want to be the most, domination. It's not based in a balance, I guess. And then your super ego, it never encompasses your super ego, which is more of your spiritual, more of your soul, more of what am I feeling? How do I incorporate balance with that? So CBT is one of those that does not approach your feelings at all. It doesn't care. And so when we're talking about ego, how having a rise in our country, we have the, everybody wants to label narcissism, but that ego is driving it. And it's all the wants of dominating peers. Let me get more stuff than everybody else. And it's because that is dominating, because we're no longer caring for our super ego. So our super ego has no nutrients. It has no vitamins. It has no balance. It has no drive to keep the ego in place, because nobody's fed it. We starved it. And so when we look at ego, we're looking at aware. We're aware that we don't have what it has. So ego is driven by deficiency. You're deficient. Super ego saying, no, you're not deficient. You're balanced. You don't need all of that stuff to be healthy. You don't need all that. So when you have one that's outweighing the others, think about the justice at like the courthouses and stuff. They have that, the balance scale is if one's up, the other one's going down. So you have to keep it balanced. So there has to be a certain amount of education that comes in it. If not, your cognition, it loses control. And so then your ego is way up here, and well, your superego, your spirituality, your balance, your heart is way down here. And so when I'm testing and I'm talking and I'm giving affirmations, I'm noticing that most people are over here and they're very uncomfortable. And why? Because they haven't been fed their superego. There's a lot of research that goes into like EFT, which is more of your super your emotion focused. However, there's a caveat to that is that's just as deficient. If you take more on one than the other, then you're actually depleting the other side. So there has to be an egalitarian one. And so esoterically, we would be speaking more of a spiritual journey. And so a lot of that is coming up of awakenings, stuff like that. But you're always awakening. We're always growing. So me and my 9 realms, when we were talking about the middle earth, is we're no longer down like, well, in Christianity they'd call it hell or purgatory or the recycle, that is below us. But in my 9 realms is we have to work our way. We'd either be in the ice giants or some of these other planes, but mid earth is pretty much in an infancy state. And so the more you can balance yourselves out and keep growing, because your egos are good, because your wants are going to want to be balanced with your super ego to make sure that they're in accordance with with your state. As you grow and you develop, you'll be raising families. And so when I'm talking about an ego, I'm thinking of a deceiver, right? Because your brain lies to you because it's always trying to finish a story. So I do a lot of therapy on trauma, and trauma is, and I know a lot of people are not going to agree with me, but hear me out. So trauma, actually, after the traumatic event happens, it's done. It's done. It's over. You're no longer subjected to that trauma. That is where it stopped. You're no longer being traumatized. But this is what happens is your brain. So your brain has to finish the story. So when a very extremely traumatic event, and I'm going to take 9/11. So when 9/11 happened, a lot of the people only got snippets because when you're in a heightened state, your brain shuts off. So you don't no longer can do your perception, and your prefrontal cortex shuts off because you're in a fight or flight mode. So you're really running off adrenaline and norepinephrine. So there's a whole bunch of other chemicals that are going on in that. So your brain is only remembering clippets because that's all it can do, because it is repeatedly running at a very fast pace. So you are full on in drive. So hopefully, especially our first responders, they practice a lot for those reasons. So their reactions are a response, but it's an isolated response that is very calculated to make sure that they get the goal met. And so when those happens, the traumatic event, it was over, except that your brain couldn't understand because there was missing pieces. And the missing pieces is what your brain is constantly doing. So it is continually going through scenario after scenario after scenario to try to make the story fit. So where is the missing piece? And it's because your brain is using an amazing computer, and it wants to finish the story. I had some clients that have come in. I have some students and some kids, and they come in and they're telling me, well, no, I'm traumatic. I've been traumatized, so I can't sleep really. And I said, well, your trauma's no longer there. That happened when you were like 4, and that was like 8 years ago. So that's not there anymore. So what's keeping it going? Well, my brain just keeps going and I keep thinking about it. I said, well, do you remember the event? And they're like, no. I was like, so it's your brain's trying to create the story. So your brain is effing with you. And that's what it does, is your brain constantly is trying to write a story that is plausible, but it is going to look for every scenario to make sure that they have all their checks off, that all of it makes sense. But here's the caveat on that part is it is also looking, if it was really traumatic and it was very extremely painful, because your superego, remember, that is all emotions, and it is balanced, it's spirituality, it's going to balance. But your ego is going, nuh-uh, we are not going through that again. And so it will go through every scenario to make sure it can get to every possible situation that could ever get you back into that situation again, and try to set up a prevention for it. So it no longer just accepts that that was done and over. It now has to prepare, and then it adds extra. So here's where the perception comes, is your perception is subjective, but it can be delusional. So your brain keeps going through so many scenarios that it adds your life experience as well, but it also adds whatever storyline you see around you. So the ego is driven off of outside exterior here in 3D, but it also, we have a lot of AI. We have a lot of avatars. We have a lot of cartoons that you can create and do it, but it doesn't do damage, but your brain will simulate it to making it damage. So before you know it, you have somebody that has isolated themselves in their house, and it's because their brain has tricked them. So this is why superego is very important. It keeps it in line. We can go back to way back at the beginning of time, of creation. Seven has been known in many theological texts as a completion number. The earth was created in 7 days. The end of the week is seven. After 14, there's, 7 times 2 is the shift of the moon. The sea currents go. Your body chemistry, biologists and scientists will tell you that body chemistry changes every 7 years. Same with your taste. Every seven years, the cycle of Earth changes, or we lose a second. The wobble. But also, you talk about the 7 fallen princes of the darkness, right? You have the 7 sisters, which are linked to the Greeks. And Plato, they talked about the stars, the constellation off of Orion's belt. They're the 7 sisters up there too, except the ones in the biblical text are a little different. They're like the counterparts of the 7 fallen princes. But then you also have your 7 deadly sins, your 7 virtues to balance them out, your 7 princes, and also the 7 archangels. So 7 is very important because it gives us what a lot of philosophers had always defined as ego, but Freud did the same thing. So does Jung. Carl Jung did the same when it comes to ego, superego. Ego was Buddhist, yin and yang. So ego would be, what would they classify as yin, which is the darkness, the black side, the deceiver, right? It needed to be balanced out with the superego, which is your light, which is your yang, your awareness. So that's kind of where they balance out. But in text all along, I'll do some other videos on, because I got special training and I got a associates in theologies of the world. So you get to see these Greek mythologies. Hermes was another one that did a lot of conversations, and he's written down in a lot of doctrines. He's also in Genesis and some of the other biblical texts as well. But down to the Greeks, Trojan talked about how they had to balance. You had your 7 deadly sins, but you also had your trials, your 7 trials, the 7 trials. And when you talk about ego, we're talking about how ego has the dark side. So let's identify it. So to talk about the dark, you'd have to talk about yin. Then you'd have to talk about the deceiver, and you'd have to talk about the unconsciousness, the wants and the drives here on the 3D, that I want to be the top of the top, narcissism. Then you're talking about like the 7 deadly sins: lust, greed, gluttony, pride, envy, wrath, which is anger, sloth. And a sloth is just more of, I'm isolated just on this. It's an obsession. So it's not more of like our sloth, that the animal. It's not really that laziness. That's not really it. Gluttony can be kind of lazy, but that's more of a repetitiveness of gluttony, is more of not overeating, but it's an indulgence in anything. So gluttony is actually an indulgent and not just a food like that. And sloth is not just lazy. Sloth is more of like an obsession. And then you have your 7 fallen princes. And I will talk about those in a minute, because I want to talk to you about the 7 sisters too. So the 7 sisters, there are deceit, strife, battle, jealousy, power hungry, air. I always making mistakes, right? Air. And then the last one is the unnamed sister. And the Greeks used to say it was, and Hermes had said that the last sister, it's also in the Genesis. And then I believe Genesis 12, I think, It's written in there. So these are also biblical. The Torah, it's a state of being, is to be careful of that. So the unnamed sister is supposed to be all deceit, strife, battle, which is arguing, fighting, wrath, right? Jealousy, power, and air mixed. But it also is the one that could be never, that was defined as they could never be denied. So the seven sisters, that's the dark side. But then you also have to have the masculine part of that dark side. So if we're looking at the awakening part, we're looking at masculine and feminine, that everybody's supposed to have parts of masculinity and parts of femininity. So if we're looking at femininity, that's the feminine, which is your, your super ego or your light inside. But then you also have your dark side, which is, your fallen princes. And so here it is. Lucifer. Did you know Lucifer is supposed to be the pride? Pride is not always a good thing. It is a seven deadly sin. Beelzebub, which is envy. Satan, which is wrath. Yes, Lucifer and Satan are different. You should look, because it actually is in a lot of texts. The Quran, I think, also identifies Jesus talking about some of that. Now, the Quran can get very hairy when it comes to outside people giving doctrines, and everybody wants to be the best of the best. That's kind of how the religion is, and spirituality is kind of like taking the pieces. There is somebody higher us up, but that's another story. So then you have Satan, which is wrath. Then you have Abaddon, which is sloth. Mammon, which is greed. And then you have Belgagor, which is gluttony. And then you have, I think, what did I wrote it down as Asmodeus, which is lust. And so if you can see that that is also part of the seven deadly sins, but there's a counterpart to it. There's a female part and there's a masculine part to those seven deadly sins. And that is kind of what we're talking about, is if you're going to be in your ego, you have to fight these, because there are seven trials. So the seven trials are betrayal, violence. Now this one is where people get really upset, and it's filial piety, and that is listening to your parents, listening to your elders. And sometimes that's not always the best thing. Sometimes you have to say no. And even in Bible, it says, honor thy mother and father. But there's a caveat to that. If you read further on, it says, unless they take you off the holy path. And so that is part of your trials, to make sure that you are still following your spiritual path. Your spiritual path is your superego. Murder is another seven trial. Indulgence, deceit, and injustice done. Those are your seven trials. So those are all, in my eyes, is the negatives, is the dark side, is the ego. And then you have to counterbalance it with your seven virtues, which is your chastity, your temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, humility, right? But then you also have your archangels, which is like Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, Jophiel, Zedekiel, and of course, Raphael, which is very, very suspicious to me, is because I've been talking about being the male and the female, and the seven deadly sisters, the the dark and the side of the superego, and so in my Norse, I have not found any in some of this others, and I probably need to study a little bit more. But in Norse Scandinavian, we had like Freya, which is our counterbalance for females, and she counterbalanced five battle, jealousy. She also was good for nurturing and abundance. And then you had Hail, which is our underworld goddess, and she would counter any purgatory. She would hold captive of those that did injustices, so she balanced it out. So there is some females on top. So there's the masculine and feminine when it comes to the superego as well. Like I said, I will do another topic on just the seven and the significance of the dark and the light of the ego and the superego. So what I wanted to come back to is, if we're talking about ego, we're talking about the dark side, we're talking about the wants here on the 3D, and that is driven by our cognition. Ego is all brain. That's all it is. Superego is the one that says, hey, slow down. Stop thinking erratic, brain. You're not true, all of it. You're missing a big piece. So Superego is more of, I'm taking pieces of your brain and I'm taking more of your heart, and then I'm coming down and coming up with an actual balance. Um, Descartes said, and it's funny because I got to talking about that the other day with a friend and some of the students, and so Descartes got thrown out, that I doubt, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. And if that's all you are just your thoughts, shouldn't we be careful what we're thinking? Descartes may have been hitting something on the head there. So if we're here on the 3D plane and we're all ego driven, then if we think, therefore you are. And if you're always doubting, then you are. Now, I've been reading the Kabbalah, and it made one little, it was amazing that I ran across this little saying, and it basically says the universe is mental, and it's all held in the mind of all of us. Food for thought. So the next video I'm going to do a little bit more in depth in the 7 deadly sins, how the 7 sisters, the 7 fallen princes, and then I'm going to bring up also the 7 balancers, your 7 virtues, your 7 trials, your 7 archangels, and also the balancing of the 7 women, the women that had to balance it out as well, as we move on into some more awareness. So just remember, your mind is always trying to finish the story, and it is not always true. So you got to balance it out. Your spirituality is important. So the next time, we'll chat it up again on ego.